Here are the facts. When you ask the residents that Trump is claiming to help, they say that they oppose it at a 79% rate. 61% of them feel less safe. When you ask them what they care about the most, it's not homicides, it's not carjackings, it's Trump's occupation of D.C. So the question then becomes, who are we helping here? Who are we helping here? The idea that public policy isn't meant to serve the public in D.C. is absolutely absurd when Trump was claiming he was helping the public. So the question that I then want to ask is, why don't we mobilize the National Guard to the 8 out of 10 red states that are the highest homicide states? If this decreases crime, and that's sufficient enough to mobilize the National Guard against the explicit will of the people of D.C., why is the National Guard not marching through the streets?
The law, he was already quoted.
I'm not talking about the law.
In today's video, Abby Phillip and Adam Mockler absolutely destroy Scott Jennings in a heated debate on Newsnight with Abby Phillip. Scott Jennings came in swinging with the usual talking points, defending Trump's reckless tariffs and even his talk of deploying the National Guard in ways that would upend federal and state authority. But Adam Mockler didn't just push back. He dismantled Scott Jennings' arguments with facts, context, and plain common sense. So let's dive in and watch how Adam Mockler shuts down Scott Jennings on Newsnight with Abby Phillip.
Do you see really that this trolling of Trump and social media, which is doing gangbusters for Gavin Newsom's social media accounts, what's the pathway to actually bringing voters back to the Democratic Party? Because the internet is not real life. That is the truth, and I'm not sure I'm seeing Democrats understanding that.
Well, there's two parts to it. First, you have to drive the attention, then you drive the narrative. So right now, he's getting the attention piece in the attention economy, and he's doing it quite well. He's getting millions of views. I also don't agree that Obama's twisting himself in pretzels. I think it's a completely logical statement. Norms in a democracy work a lot like consent. You can't have meaningful consent when only one side is engaging in that, and you can't have meaningful norms when one side is engaging. So when Obama says we're okay with temporary redistricting, that's what it is, temporary redistricting, proportional to what Texas is doing, I don't think that's very hypocritical. But when it comes to Newsom, get the attention, drive the narrative. That's what Democrats should do.
I think the Democrats are hemorrhaging voters because they've chosen all the wrong constituencies. They seem to care more about illegal aliens than American citizens, violent criminals than law-abiding citizens, and the Palestinian flag more than the American flag.
That is not true, and that is
when you take those positions on things like that, people tend to run to the other party. And
is there one mainstream Democrat that said he likes illegal immigrants over?
And you know that's not necessarily
Chris Van Hollen? There's one.
You said that? Chris Van Hollen did not say that.
He went and had margaritas at my time.
He met with Kilmar Armando Abrego Garcia, who was brought back to the United States. The administration conceded that he was sent there wrongfully, so Chris Van Hollen...
I mean, if you want to keep going down this road...
All right, Alencia.
You claim that Democrats like crime.
Hold on. As someone who does a lot of messaging in the Democratic Party, we do have a messaging issue. But the real thing here is that we have to go to these voters and talk to them about the pain that they are feeling before we bring the policy solution. Because we do have the policy solution. We just have to figure out a better way of listening to our voters. And I think we are in this crisis right now where we are forced to do that. And I do believe that Democrats can come back and gain these voters back.
Watching this debate, I couldn't help but notice how Scott Jennings kept leaning on the same tired talking points: law and order, protecting communities, without ever grappling with the actual data on the ground. And here's the thing, the numbers don't back him up. Take crime rates, for example. 8 of the 10 states with the highest homicide rates are Republican-led, many of them with so-called tough-on-crime governors. Mississippi, Louisiana, and Missouri have homicide rates that dwarf Washington, D.C. Yet, there's never any talk from the GOP about deploying the National Guard there. That alone exposes the double standard. It's not about safety, it's about politics. And let's talk about public opinion. In Washington, D.C., nearly 80% of residents oppose Trump's deployment of the Guard, with a majority saying it actually makes them feel less safe. So when Scott Jennings tries to argue that Trump was helping, who exactly was he helping? Because clearly it wasn't the people who live there. The other piece here is democracy itself. The Impoundment Control Act, states' rights, and even constitutional protections all point to one thing. The executive branch isn't supposed to just steamroll over local communities because it looks good politically. When Republicans argue for states' rights on issues like guns or abortion, but suddenly flip to federal overreach when it's DC, that's not principle, that's hypocrisy. So at the end of the day, Adam Mockler was spot on in pushing back. If Trump's policies were truly about reducing crime, then red states with sky-high homicide rates would see National Guard deployments first. But they don't, because this was never about safety. It was about optics and control.
This is a horrible precedent. This is socialism. All of you people were freaked out about Mamdani in New York City wanting government-run grocery stores and saying the people need to seize the means of production. That's what Harold Lutnick is doing right now, saying that the government must seize the controlling interest in Intel, the means of production, in order to get government money. You can't just be against socialism when the left does it.
Phil, can you respond to that? Because I think it is perplexing that conservatives would be okay with all of that.
The idea that Donald Trump's not going to have influence, that's silly. He's absolutely going to have influence, but he's not weighing in and destroying the free market. He's not doing what Biden did, which is going in and trying to reshape the entire auto industry in his image. What he's really doing right now is he's saying there are better ways, but the free market capitalist
Wait. Are you talking? What are you talking about when you talk about Biden and the auto industry?
Oh gosh, did you not see what he did? There was no demand for EVs to the extent that the Biden administration wanted, so they regulated it into existence. They funded it to make sure it had subsidies to survive. And then when the subsidies went away, the industry collapsed, which was a clear indication that industry was not ready for its day.
Okay.
You keep citing the free market, but politicizing companies and allocating capital politically is not the free market. Supply and demand is the free market. And you say that Biden reshaped the EV industry in his image.
Oh, yeah,
Trump is reshaping the entire tariff global order in his image. He's placing tariffs on countries that make no sense whatsoever.
I told you had to buy a certain vegetable at the store, and if you didn't like it, that was just too bad. That was the only one you could buy, and I was going to subsidize that vegetable industry. And oh, by the way, I was going to regulate that by the time 2030 came along, that's the only vegetable you could buy.
If I told you I'm going to place tariffs on every single country with no discretion whatsoever, and you're going to say he's not reshaping the global order when it comes to that?
The budget that we had last year or last month, we actually had a budget surplus for the first time ever. The tariffs are working.
Sheila, hold on. Sheila, first of all, it is not true that you can't go to an auto dealer and buy a non-EV car. So that is not an accurate description.
I said he was reshaping the market.
Yeah, but you described it as if the government were telling people that they can't go get something else at the car dealership when they absolutely can.
Have you seen California?
But the other, you can.
To have better public safety and more reasonable safety standards within Washington, D.C.
So now it doesn't matter, Scott Jennings, that voters are not happy with what Trump's doing, don't feel safer, all of that.
I don't care what they think. I mean, these are the same people who elected the mayor and city council that ran the city's public safety into the ground in the first place.
You don't care what the residents...
They don't know what's good for them.
You don't care what the residents of D.C. think.
I do not. I do not care one bit, and I'll tell you something else.
I feel like I do remember just a couple weeks ago you were saying, well, secretly D.C. residents really want this because they know the crime is so bad.
I don't know
now
what
we
they
actually
want.
have the
I know what
numbers
they
that
need.
say, will Trump's federal takeover reduce violent crime? 65% say no, just 20% say yes. Do you feel like the presence of federal officers makes you feel safer, more safe, 18%, less safe, 61%?
Why would they say that?
What really stood out in this debate is how quickly Scott and Phil defaulted to buzzwords like socialism and free market without grappling with the reality of what's actually happening. And let's be clear, Trump's economic approach is not free market capitalism, it's economic nationalism. Plain and simple. His blanket tariffs didn't just reshape the global order, they directly raised costs for American consumers. Studies from the Nonpartisan Tax Foundation and the Peterson Institute found that Trump's tariffs functioned as a tax hike on U.S. households, costing the average family between $800 and $1,200 per year during his term. That's not a theory, that's a measurable impact. And on the EV issue, Phil's analogy about vegetables misses the point entirely. Biden's EV push didn't outlaw gas cars. In fact, EVs still only make up about 8% of new US car sales, and anyone can walk onto a lot and buy a gas-powered vehicle. What Biden did was what governments across the world are doing, using subsidies and initiatives to encourage innovation in a critical sector. China has been heavily subsidizing EVs for years, which is why they dominate the market. Without federal support, US automakers would fall even further behind. That's not socialism, that's industrial policy. The same kind of policy Republicans championed for decades when it comes to oil, gas, and defense. Now, when it comes to Trump's deployment of federal officers in DC, Scott Jennings flat out saying he doesn't care what residents think is jaw-dropping. Polls show 79% of DC residents opposed Trump's actions, with 61% saying they felt less safe under the occupation. That's not just bad optics, that's a fundamental rejection of democratic governance. If the people you're claiming to protect overwhelmingly say you're making things worse, then you're not protecting them, you're imposing control. And it's no coincidence Republicans don't call for National Guard deployments in red states like Louisiana or Mississippi, where homicide rates are actually higher than in DC. It's selective outrage driven by politics, not public safety.
Here are the facts. When you ask the residents that Trump is claiming to help, they say that they oppose it at a 79% rate. 61% of them feel less safe. When you ask them what they care about the most, it's not homicides, it's not carjackings, it's Trump's occupation of D.C. So the question then becomes, who are we helping here? Who are we helping here? The idea that public policy isn't meant to serve the public in D.C. is absolutely absurd when Trump was claiming he was helping the public. So the question that I then want to ask is, why don't we mobilize the National Guard to the 8 out of 10 red states that are the highest homicide states? If this decreases crime, and that's sufficient enough to mobilize the National Guard against the explicit will of the people of D.C., why is the National Guard not marching through the streets?
The law.
But one thing, because what Adam just said was something that we asked here at the table yesterday. Why not address violence in all these other parts of the country?
Not enough Democrats.
Why, and I'm not saying that President Trump should do it, but all these red state governors have the ability to mobilize their National Guards within their own states. Why aren't they doing it?
Right now, I don't think they feel the need to. But right
even
now,
though
the Home Rule
violence
Act,
levels are higher in some of those
states
cities
don't
than
have
they
a
are in
Home Rule
DC.
Act, but they do have a governor.
No, but they have a governor and they have a National Guard that's under the control of the government.
We're talking about D.C.
They
right
can
now.
deploy that at
But
any
their
time.
cities have more crime
Do you
than
not see
Washington,
the difference
D.C.?
between our national capital and every other city in
You're
America?
saying that the
No,
National Guard is
no
a
one's
defeater
saying
of
that.
crime, but then you refuse to endorse the National Guard being put in other states. You're going to say the National Guard is lowering crime
I'm arguing
rates.
that the national capital, Washington, D.C., exists in a different federal zone, as was pointed out.
Yeah, but
A,
that
and
is
B,
only
and B,
that
it's
is
our
only
national
as it relates
capital.
to
I'm sorry,
Hold
it
on,
is different
Scott.
than Memphis
It
or
is
whatever.
only as it relates to Donald Trump's role in this whole thing.
The
When it
president's
comes,
role.
the president's, that's what I'm saying. When it comes to the rest of the country, governors have the. I'll let you
Governors
get
have the
it.
ability.
Governors have the
Yes.
authority to do what Trump is doing, and they are not doing.
What's wild about this whole exchange is how Scott Jennings tries to dance around the numbers Adam Mockler brought up, but the facts don't lie. Polling from the Washington Post and George Washington University show that nearly 80% of DC residents opposed Trump's federal occupation, and over 60% said it made them feel less safe. That's not just a talking point. That's what people directly impacted are saying. If public safety policy leaves the public feeling less safe, then what's the point? And here's the kicker. Scott Jennings admits that red state governors have the same power to call in the National Guard, yet they don't, even though states like Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama consistently top the list for homicide rates. According to CDC data, Mississippi's homicide rate is more than double that of DC, but you don't hear about MAGA pundits calling for military patrols in Jackson. Why? Because this was never about safety. It was about optics and control in the nation's capital. On top of that, using the military domestically for routine law enforcement has historically been a disaster. During the 2020 protests, National Guard deployments in DC led to excessive force, wrongful arrests, and even the tear gassing of peaceful demonstrators for Trump's infamous Bible photo op. That's not law and order, that's authoritarianism. Plain and simple. So Adam Mockler was right to press the point. If you really believe troops in the streets reduce crime, why not apply that logic evenly across the map? The fact that Trump and his defenders only push it in DC, a majority black, heavily Democratic city, tells you everything you need to know. Pause. Are you getting tired of getting half the story from biased news sources? One outlet says one thing and another says the complete opposite. How are you supposed to know what's actually true? That's where ground news comes in. It lets you compare how different media outlets, left, right, and center, are covering the same story. So you can see the full picture instead of just the echo chamber. And here's the best part. Click the link in the description and get 40% off the Vantage tier, which gives you even deeper insights into media bias and political trends. Stay informed, think for yourself, and check out Ground News in the description down below.